Good day. Last 2 days in Ukraine, in my coverage of the conflict in Ukraine, I've been discussing principally the Russian missile strikes and the effects of those on Ukraine and on its energy infrastructure and the growing crisis that that's causing. And by the way, that situation remains entirely unresolved. I was getting more news this morning, just as I was preparing to make this video, that there'd been more Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. I think there were. I'm not entirely sure whether they actually targeted the energy infrastructure as such. Blackouts are now taking place, or continuing to take place across Ukraine. I've heard, for example, that Kiev, as of the time of making this video, has only 50% of its power supply. Of course, I can't corroborate that. I'm not there. But there are lots of reports about power blackouts across Ukraine. But it could be that that this is the result not so much of more Russian missile attacks over and above those of the previous days, but rather of the continuing cascading effect of the missile strikes of the previous days. I've heard, for example, that some parts of the system are now breaking down and in some cases actually catching fire because of overloads caused by the attempts by the Ukrainian authorities to try to transmit too much electricity through too few exchange points. I'm not going to pretend, by the way, that I have much understanding of how energy systems work or the kind of infrastructure that's involved, but I think you get the general idea. Anyway, that was what I was talking about the previous days, and of course it remains so far the overarching story. I saw, for example, that Olena Zelenskaya, Zelensky's wife, gave a defiant interview in which she said that the Ukrainian people would endure not just one winter like this, but many winters like this, that they would continue to accept the hardship and deprivation that goes with these missile strikes as part of their campaign to keep the war going. And of course, President Zelensky himself has now given an interview to the Financial Times in which he said that the only way the conflict can end in Ukraine is if all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, is returned to Ukraine, and otherwise the war will continue and the conflict will continue. And the only way, in other words, for the conflict to end is through some kind of Ukrainian victory. So you're getting defiant statements from Ukraine. But the reality, the actual reality of the situation on the ground in Ukraine is a collapsing energy system, a collapsing financial and economic system. We're getting reports now that more and more Ukrainian officials are coming round to the idea that the cities will have to be evacuated at some point. Kiev's mayor Klitschko, who's been, by the way, Kiev's mayor ever since the Maidan events of February 2014, he is also now increasingly, it seems to me, talking about evacuating or asking people to leave Kiev. And I'm also seeing, by the way, pictures which may not be representative of the whole situation across Kiev, or even, and certainly not perhaps over Ukraine, but nonetheless these pictures do exist of supermarkets in Kiev with rows upon rows of empty food positions, of a shortage of bread, shortage of water, a shortage of all of these things. So this is the big story over the last couple of days. It's been, in fact, in some ways, the big story over the last couple of weeks, ever since the Russians began this systematic missile campaign against Ukraine's energy system back on the 10th of October. And there's no sign, as I said, that that's slackening off to any degree. But alongside that, there are developments or continuing fighting at least on the front lines. Now, the situation on the front lines, as I've said previously, is stable. The Russians are continuing to build up their forces. They're continuing to gradually fill up the units with the reservists, the 300,000 reservists and 80,000 volunteers that have been called up or have joined the military. Apparently, Mr. Prigozhin of the Wagner Group has been busy recruiting more young men from Russia's prisons, offering them a future, as he would say, a way to some kind of redemption. That would be his way of explaining this, by offering them a place in the Wagner organization. He's clearly doing this, by the way, with official support, which is something we shouldn't overestimate. But anyway, there's an awful lot of that going on still. The Russians are steadily building up their forces in Ukraine, steadily preparing for their next moves, their big moves, which will probably come later this winter. But overall, the situation has been stable on the front lines. And as I've said previously, given that the Russians are in the process of building up their reserves, building up their forces, sending more equipment to the front lines, all of those sort of things, given that that is so, I think one must acknowledge that it is in the Russian interest that things overall remain stable. Even if the Russians were in a position to conduct big offensives now, I suspect that they would not do so until all those reservists and fresh equipment had come. Because, of course, if you engage in big offensives, you are running your forces down, you're going to lose men, you're going to lose material, and you're going to tire the men who are engaged in all that fighting. And that will mean that when your big punch comes, it will be less strong than it would have been if you had waited until you were ready. So, as I said, it seems to me, looking at this, as far as I can see and understand it, that it is in the Russian interest that things remain stable on the front lines. But that doesn't mean that within that overall stability, things aren't happening. And in fact, Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, one of the two breakaway regions of the Donbass that, according to Russian law, are now incorporated within Russia. Anyway, Denis Pushilin has said that the Russians are advancing all across their front line. Now, when Pushilin says this, one has to be careful because, of course, he's an active participant in this war. And also, one has to also say that he's probably not fully correct, because when he means what he means by the front line, I suspect probably means the front line in Donbass. I don't get the sense that, for example, that the Russians are carrying out any offensive operations in Zaporozhye region or in Eastern Kherson region or those sort of places. But there is some evidence, in fact, there's a good accumulation of evidence that the Russians are indeed pushing forward along the front lines in the Donbass. And we've just received reports earlier today that the Russians are either in the process of capturing or, and the latest reports strongly suggest this, have actually captured a small village called Novoselovskoye in northern Donbass, which is between the larger settlement of Svatovo and Kupyansk. Kupyansk being a town, one of the towns that was captured by Ukraine over the course of its Kharkiv offensive, which took place, of course, principally in September. And this is an interesting pointer perhaps to the way things are going, because after the fall of Kupyansk, and especially after the Ukrainian recapture of Liman, there was widespread expectations that the Ukrainian army was going to continue its advance, and there was lots of discussion about what they were going to do, both in Ukrainian channels and in Russian channels. A lot of this picked up by Western commentators like the Institute for the Study of War and the British Ministry of Defense, for example. And there was a general agreement that the Ukrainians would try to break in to northern Lugansk region, that they would try to advance on the towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which the Russians, of course, captured earlier in the war, back in June, back at the end of June, and that this would be achieved also through the capture of Kremena, a village in this area, and also Svatovo, both of which supposedly stood astride the Russian communications and logistical chains. I have to say, and I'm on record of saying this, I was much more skeptical that either Svatovo or Kremena were quite as important as some of these commentaries implied. But that was what people back in September, early October, were expecting the Ukrainians to do, that they were going to advance on Svatovo and on Kremena, cut off Russia's communications, and then launch a further advance towards Lysychansk and perhaps Severodonetsk, and conceivably even try to recapture those two places. I have to say, I always thought that those kind of operations were beyond Ukraine's reach, but that was what a lot of people were saying was going to happen. In fact, what has happened instead is that the Ukrainians have indeed launched multiple attacks towards both Svatovo and Kremena, and every one of those attacks has been repulsed, and repulsed apparently with heavy losses. And there are reports, by the way, that the Russian defenses in this area have been getting stronger, that they've been firming up all the time. And of course, General Surovikin, the overall Russian commander-in-chief, in that interview he gave more than a month ago now to Russia 1 television, spoke about fortifying the front lines as being one of his priorities, and undoubtedly he meant in part the front lines in this region. Now, the point about the possible or apparent capture of Novoselovskoye, and there doesn't seem to be much disagreement that the Russians are indeed attacking this place, and it's a small place, is that, of course, it being between Svatovo and Kupyansk, it's going to make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to advance on Svatovo. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it does mean that there's now this village or settlement in the way, which the Russians can fortify and support, and it means that the prospect of capturing Svatovo, however important or not that place actually is, that goal, that objective is starting to recede. There is perhaps another further factor, which is, of course, that this whole Ukrainian offensive properly started in the attack on Kharkiv region in September. At that time, when the Ukrainians launched their attack on Kharkiv, on Balakleya, and further towards Izium, and eventually Kupyansk, which of course they eventually captured. Up to that point, all the focus had been on Kherson region. This was the place which everybody thought would be the centerpiece of Ukraine's offensive. And instead, Ukrainians got bogged down at the early part of September in attrition battles in Kherson region, which caused them enormous casualties, whereas it turned out instead that they were also going to launch this offensive in Kharkiv region towards Izium and Kupyansk. And as I discussed at the time, it turned out that the Russian forces had already largely vacated that area, but there were far fewer Russian troops in Izium and Kupyansk than anybody imagined at the time. And there's been lots of discussions as to why that was the case. But anyway, the net effect of that was that the Ukrainians, again, despite suffering quite heavy losses, were able to capture this territory very quickly. So, if the Russians, part of General Surovikin's plan, is to launch a kind of counter-offensive towards Kupyansk and Izium, and if, of course, eventually he recaptures these places, well, that will be a heavy psychological blow for Ukraine, because it will mean that Ukraine will have lost precisely that territory which it captured as part of its first offensive in September, its first real military achievement in the war. And it will show conclusively that Ukraine is once again on the back foot. Now, on top of that, the Russians, as well as perhaps wanting to reverse what was for them a major psychological blow, as I've discussed in previous programs, the withdrawal from Kherson, which was clearly something that the Russian command had decided to do for logistical and supply and other reasons, and carefully prepared for. By contrast, the Kharkiv withdrawal was something that was completely unexpected in Russia and which hurt morale in Russia considerably. Anyway, despite the fact that probably one of the factors that is driving the Russians towards wanting to recapture this territory, however important or not it may be in the overall strategic picture of the war, is no doubt psychological, but it's also apparently the case that there's growing rumors and murmurings in Russia that what the Ukrainians are really going to do is not try to march south from Zaporozhye to the Sea of Azov. This is beyond their strength. These areas have now become very heavily fortified. There's lots of Russian troops there. What the Ukrainians might try to do in order to embarrass the Russians, in order to cause a real crisis in Russia, might be to advance from Kharkiv region into Russia itself, into Belgorod region, perhaps ultimately Kursk region, capture Russian territory that even Ukraine accepts is Russian, and that might be a major psychological blow for the Russians were it to happen. And the rationale is that the obvious launch point for such a Ukrainian offensive would be this area of Kharkiv region, in effect from Kupyansk, and therefore the recapture of Kupyansk is not just important in providing a kind of psychological relief for the Russians and demoralizing the Ukrainians, it's also important in order to protect the Russian border. Well, I don't know whether Ukraine actually does have such plans. I think it would be a very, very risky, indeed extremely reckless thing for Ukraine to do, to try to advance into Russia itself. But who knows? And it's sometimes the case that the perception of a threat is as important in military planning as whether or not that threat itself exists. And I can fully believe that there are people in Moscow who are genuinely concerned about this possibility, and that might explain the move to capture Novoselovskoye and perhaps advance eventually towards Kupyansk. Anyway, That's one battle that's taking place. There's also lots of reports, accumulating reports, but again, at the moment, they're difficult to sort out and sift through. But there's lots of reports that the Russians have made significant progress in clearing Marinka. This is this fortified village or town near Donetsk city. And in and around Ugledar, this other important town in southern Donetsk region. There's also reports that the Ukrainians are sending troops who had previously been used in Kherson region to try to reinforce their positions in Ugledar, which is this place which is seen as being very important to them. And I've also, by the way, heard that the Ukrainians are also rushing troops from Kherson region to Bakhmut, that they're trying to reinforce their positions in Bakhmut. And there's apparently increasing numbers of pictures now, film from the area of Bakhmut and from the northern suburb of Bakhmut, which is Soledar. Pictures of street fighting there. And it seems that the Chechen forces have now also been committed to this battle for Bakhmut and for Soledar. And that no doubt explains in part why the Ukrainians may be rushing reinforcements to these places. Now, the British Ministry of Defence has claimed that the Russians are relocating the airborne troops that had previously been the backbone of the defense force in Kherson, west of the Dnieper, to Donbass, to the area of Donbass. And this is, I have to say, entirely consistent with my understanding of General Surovikin's thinking. As I said previously, I'm far from convinced that he really is planning big arrow offensives like Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has suggested, marching towards Volyn, trying to cut off Ukraine from its supply lines from the west, doing these big dramatic moves. I've said that Surovikin himself has quite openly talked about a war of attrition, about grinding Ukraine down. And I would have thought that the place where Surovikin would want to grind the Ukrainians down would be first and foremost Donbass. He would want to complete the original mission set by President Putin way back in February, which is to clear Ukrainian troops fully from the Donbass region, bring that entire region under Russian control and ending the shelling of Donetsk city. And the reallocation of Russian paratroopers to this area is fully consistent with that. And I'm going to make my own guess. I think the bulk of these 380,000 reinforced troops that are heading towards the front lines in eastern Ukraine, Russian troops, reservists and all that, will be allocated to defending Zaporozhye and to completing the advance in Donbass and probably in places like Kupyansk, rather than these dramatic advances that people have been talking about from Belarus. That's my own estimate. But I also think that there's a difference in the sense that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are sending troops from Kherson, troops that were previously fighting each other in Kherson region, to Donbass. That's clearly where the weight of the battle is taking place. But there is a difference. And I think that difference is in two parts. Firstly, we should be very clear that the Russian forces that are heading towards Donbass are of far greater number than the Ukrainian forces that were previously at Kherson region. Now, nobody has ever come up with a complete number, an accurate number of the forces in Kherson region. It's been Ukrainian forces in Kherson region. I've read figures of up to 60,000 men there. But of course, some of them have been allocated to Zaporozhye. Some of them have been allocated to defend Vuhledar. Others, as I said, are heading to Bakhmut. I don't know how many has been allocated to each of these places, but we can't be talking about anything like the 380,000 men that have been coming from Russia. And of course, if we're talking about the airborne troops from Kherson region west of the Dnieper, well, we're talking about perhaps 25,000 of these. But it seems that unlike the Ukrainian forces, who are going to be deployed almost immediately to try to defend Bakhmut and Vuhledar, in other words, who are not going to be given much rest time, much time to reorganize, retrain, refresh, it looks as if these airborne troops are being held back for the time being, though they are being given time to refit, retrain, refresh, rest before they are thrown into the battle. So there is already, it seems to me, a clear difference between the way in which the Russians and the Ukrainians are operating at the moment in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. Well, of course, the Russians don't consider this to be eastern Ukraine anymore. But anyway, what we see is Russian moves, the Russians carrying out advances towards Kupyansk, maybe planning some kind of offensive there in the future. It's highly likely. The Russians heavily reinforcing in Donbass, the Russians making progress in Soledar, perhaps in Bakhmut city itself, and the Russians, by all accounts, making significant progress now in Marinka and near Donetsk city, and also fighting a tough attrition war in Vuhledar, where they also seem to be making progress. All of this preparatory to this big offensive, which one soon enough surely will come. By the way, even as the Russians have been launching their missile strikes against the Ukrainian energy system and have been carrying out these attacks on the front lines, they've also been carrying out missile strikes in the rear of Ukraine's armed forces. And this, by the way, very much reflects a pattern of Russian actions, which Brian Beletic from the New Atlas has pointed out the Russians carried out in Syria, and we see it being used increasingly now in Ukraine itself, which is that the Russians very often don't focus most of their aerial and missile strikes on the Ukrainian forces that are actually involved in the actual fighting on the front lines, just as they didn't do this in terms of the missile and, well, the airstrikes that they were carrying out in Syria during the bigger period of the fighting there in 2015 and 2016. Rather, they attack the base areas and supply routes of those frontline troops. And Pushilin has actually spoken about this. He's spoken about how the attacks on the infrastructure system are disrupting Ukraine's transport system, its railway system. That's making it more difficult for the troops on the front lines to get supplies. But I've also, for the first time, by the way, seen photographs of a Ukrainian supply train laden with heavy equipment, all smashed up by what I presume was a Russian missile attack. And I gather that there's been an increasing number now of these sort of cases. So it seems to me that this is another part of what the Russians are doing with this increase in the tempo of operations, which is that they're attacking the Ukrainian supply routes in perhaps a more organized and systematic way than they have done before. And here perhaps General Surovikin's background is instructive because, of course, the overall commander, Russian commander in Syria during the fighting in 2015 and 2016, when the Russians adopted the tactic of hitting the supply lines, was of course, the jihadi supply lines in that conflict, was of course Surovikin, and it looks as if he might be doing the same thing now in Ukraine. And there's also been a large flurry of Russian missile and airstrikes on Kherson region west of the Dnieper, the very area that the Russians withdrew from a few weeks ago and which the Ukrainians have reoccupied. And the Ukrainians have been trying to move artillery to the west bank of the Dnieper. They're finding themselves constantly shelled by Russian artillery on the east bank. And as I've discussed, they're suffering heavy losses, and their whole control of this area seems to be fairly tenuous. And we're now seeing Russian missile strikes being carried out against them all the time. So that's, I think, a reasonable summary of the situation on the front lines. Of course, it's not only a war that's been fought with weapons, with battles. We get lots going on all the time in the field of diplomacy, in the field of action that's economic action. And interestingly enough, it looks as if the European Union is now coming apart on this whole idea of the oil price cap. There doesn't seem to be any consensus about this. The Poles want to set the cap on Russian oil at $30, which is a ridiculous figure. The Greeks, the Maltese, the Cypriots, other countries that have big shipping industries want to set it at $70 a barrel, which would be consistent with the existing market price for Russian oil. It's now apparently accepted that Russian oil that is transferred at sea from one ship to another or from one place to another, but goes through all the usual thing. Well, that's not going to be covered by this at all. This whole plan is starting to have more exemptions than a Swiss cheese has holes. I've just seen a report that Hungary is claiming that the oil that continues to be supplied to Hungary by pipeline from Russia, via the Druzhba pipeline across Ukraine, by the way, that won't also be susceptible to an oil price cap, something which I find astonishing. That this whole plan, never a rational or a sensible plan, is starting to creak and break down under the weight of its very, very obvious contradictions. And I presume that at some point, some kind of agreement or consensus will be reached. But the Russians have already said that it looks increasingly as if the Europeans, the objective now for the Europeans is not so much to achieve a real price cap, an enforceable price cap, but rather to come to an agreement with each other. In other words, the objective is no longer any more inflicting real economic injury on the Russians, something which even European officials have quietly conceded amongst each other is beyond their reach. It is instead papering over the increasing cracks that this whole oil price cap idea is creating for them. Now, when the oil price cap was first proposed by Janet Yellen, I think back in March, most of the European countries at that time, including Germany, by the way, rejected it. They said it would be unworkable. And they were right. Instead, of course, the Germans and Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, went for the import ban on Russian oil into the EU, except, of course, that eventually became an import ban on Russian oil shipped directly from Russia by sea. And every part of that sentence needs to be made clear because, of course, Russian oil exported to India and then re-exported by Indian shippers to Europe, that's not covered apparently by this import ban, even though there will be a significant markup on that oil. But anyway, the Europeans knew or said back in March that this oil price cap idea was a bad one. And yet, they've gone ahead with this American proposal, which is causing them nothing but trouble and which has simply exposed more divisions amongst them. And we see more quarrels now between all of the various European states. So I've discussed previously how Macron and Scholz are apparently barely on speaking terms now. They're struggling to find any agreements on any issues. The Italians and the French have furiously quarreled with each other over the migrant issue. The Poles are at odds with the Europeans about practically everything. The Poles wanting to take an even harder line towards the Russians that most Europeans want. The Hungarians at odds with the Europeans about practically everything, with the difference that, unlike the Poles, they want to take a much more moderate line with the Russians than the European consensus apparently demands. And of course, a growing realization in Europe that the whole sanctions war, that the whole policy that the European Union is following since the start of the war has been a complete disaster. There is a massive increase in energy prices, and with the weather becoming colder, I've now seen data which shows that the gas reserves that the Germans built up, the Europeans built up in advance of the winter, that they're becoming depleted. Perhaps there'll be enough gas there to eke out the winter, but there doesn't seem to be any clear idea about what to do after that. The option of refilling those reserves with gas from Russia having gone. So we have this complicated situation with the gas. By the way, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, has said that there are no restrictions on imports of gas from Russia. There's no sanctions on importing gas from Russia, except, of course, no explanation of how that gas is going to come from Russia. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 having been shut down, the Yamal pipeline no longer working, the Russians now starting to take steps against the Druzhba pipeline, all of that. So the sanctions have not achieved the effects that the Europeans expected. They've come back and they've hurt them. They've hurt them badly. And now we're starting to see growing criticism in Europe of the United States. And we've had a whole series of comments from French officials, from German officials including Robert Habeck, of course, the German Vice Chancellor, the Green politician who's been at the forefront of waging the sanctions war against Russia. Well, Habeck is angrily talking about how the Americans are sending overpriced LNG to Europe, that the cost of LNG supplied by the US to Europe is too high. And now we've seen the sudden panic reaction in Europe that President Biden's anti-inflation bill with its enormous green subsidies is acting as a massive inducement to European industry to relocate to the United States. And just before I made this program, this whole issue of President Biden and his subsidy to industry to develop green technologies in the United States, well, that's suddenly become the headline story in the Financial Times. And we're reading about an existential threat to European industry from all of this, and this subsidy that President Biden is supposedly proposing. And we also read that this is all in the Financial Times, mind you, that the Europeans are now desperately looking for some way to set up their own subsidy mechanism to counter America's subsidies, the subsidies America is providing to industries that relocate to the United States. So it's beginning to look as if, under the pressure of this conflict, because let us be very clear, all of these events are connected. The conflict is one reason, the Ukrainian conflict, the sanctions are one reason why European industry is finding itself under such pressure in Europe, why these American subsidies are becoming so attractive. So European subsidies will not only have to at least match what the Americans are offering in terms of subsidies, they will logically have to exceed it, and exceed it substantially, to make up for the difference in energy costs. So we are looking at an enormous subsidy package. That's what the Europeans really want to do. Well, we can see how this economic war that is being waged by the Europeans against the Russians, it's not only creating divisions within Europe over things like the oil price cap, but it's even creating now potential for economic rivalries, for divisions within the West itself. Europe versus America, each trying to out-subsidize the other. Again, if the idea of this whole conflict, which I suspect it was, if the whole idea right at the outset was to solidify the collective West, to create this Russian bogey figure, to unite the West against the Russians, and to enforce bloc discipline in that way, well, in the short term, it succeeded. But in the medium to longer term, as these economic rivalries grow, one can see how it's going to intensify the stresses and the strains. And meanwhile, the collective West has to worry about its other errant member, Turkey. Is Turkey part of the collective West or not? It's still a member of NATO. It's still an aspirant for EU membership, but it's increasingly showing signs of wanting to realign with the Eurasian powers. And of course, it's now engaging in military activities in northern Syria and Iraq. And the Turks are now saying quite openly that once the present bombing campaign in northern Syria ends, much of it targeted at Kurdish controlled in effect, American-controlled energy, oil installations in eastern Syria, that there was going to be in December, there's going to be a Turkish ground offensive in this very area. And the United States has said that Turkey has the right to defend itself, but we're now getting comments from US senators and Congress people questioning whether Turkey is even an ally at all. And one can see how this conflict, far from separating Turkey from the Eurasian states, in a curious kind of way, with all the intense interactions that go on between the Russians and the Turks all the time, this endless dialogue, even as the two try to maneuver around each other all the time. But in the end, this conflict, paradoxically, and as I've discussed previously, seems to be binding them together. And even as bloc discipline in the West actually weakens as opposed to strengthens, the exact opposite, as I said, from what was originally forecast when this conflict began, what we see is how the other side, and here I mean principally China, is now starting to make big moves. A short time ago, we did a program on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, in which we discussed the fact that President Xi Jinping of China is planning to visit Saudi Arabia and that he's going to have talks with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and no doubt with the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman himself, and other Saudi officials, and how all this seems to be working towards drawing Saudi Arabia into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and into the BRICS structure. And of course, the BRICS is planning a new reserve currency in rivalry to the dollar. And of course, if Saudi Arabia were to demand payment for its oil in this reserve currency, which it would logically want to do if it became part of the BRICS, that would be a major blow against the dollar's position as a reserve currency. So we've already talked about that. But it now turns out that this trip by Xi Jinping to Saudi Arabia is going to be even more ambitious than what we've just talked about. It's not just going to be Saudi Arabia's role as a possible aspiring member of the BRICS and of the SCO, and of Saudi Arabia's possible participation in this BRICS reserve currency. It looks as if Xi Jinping is coming to Saudi Arabia, with Saudi Arabia hosting a China-Arab summit. A summit, in other words, at which all the Arab states, including possibly Syria, by the way, will all be represented and will all be meeting the Chinese. And this comes after a few months after Lavrov did a tour of the Middle East and had a meeting with the Arab League. I think that was in Egypt, in fact. But anyway, we're going to have this massive meeting being prepared between the Chinese president and the Arab states, hosted by MBS, the entire Arab world tilting towards China. And again, in other programs we've done on the Duran, and in discussions I've made in my own videos, I've spoken about the recent events in Africa, where there's been a whole succession of African states in West Africa that have distanced themselves from France, that have broken off connections with France, the former imperial and post-imperial, post-colonial master of the area. And a fact, by the way, which has upset and annoyed President Macron, but he doesn't seem to be able to do very much about it. And now these West African states are now tilting towards the Russians especially. And we've also had news about this peace agreement in Ethiopia, between the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayans, with the Tigrayans apparently essentially conceding their the conflict to the Ethiopian federal government, though I've been advised by a correspondent that the United States is still trying to disrupt that agreement. But anyway, all of this is going on in Ethiopia, and there's now reports that just as China is preparing for a big summit meeting with the Arab states, with Xi Jinping coming to meet the Arab leaders in Saudi Arabia, hosted by the Saudis, so a big Russia-Africa summit is now on the horizon. So, far from there being more bloc discipline in the West, we now see arguments, quarrels, recriminations starting to grow. Quarrels and arguments about the oil price cap, quarrels and arguments between the French and the Germans on unrelated topics, between the Italians and the French, between everybody and the Turks, and between the Europeans and the Americans. And what we also saw recently at the G20 is how the attempt by the G7, the United States and its allies, to try to basically hijack, control the entire G20, trying to isolate the Russians, how that received enormous pushback from all the other non-G7, non-Western states. And we also learned that Japan has now been given an exemption. It can buy LNG at whatever price it wants from the Russians. They're apparently going to go ahead with their energy cooperation with the Russians. And the Japanese are apparently also establishing hotlines with Beijing. They may not have good relations with China, but apparently they're becoming uneasy about the direction of events. And we also hear that Samsung and the other South Korean companies might be considering now re-entering the Russian market. It's one of the most extraordinary developments that's happened, because like most people, right at the start of this conflict, when the sanctions were announced, this enormous sanctions campaign was announced back in March, I did feel that the United States had emerged as the big winner. The cancellation of Nord Stream 2 in particular, rather the indefinite suspension of Nord Stream 2 in particular, seemed to me to mark the moment when rigid bloc discipline within the Western alliance was being finally reimposed. Well, it seems to me that it's becoming increasingly clear that all of that was predicated on the expectation that the sanctions, that the economic war would trigger a crisis in Russia, that there would be a political crisis following upon an economic crisis, and that a new weakened and humiliated Russia would bend its knee to the West. That hasn't happened. We see divisions in the West growing. We see the other side making its big moves. And of course, if events in Ukraine continue along the course that tentative indications suggest, with these Russian advances that I discussed at the start of this program, with the Russian build-up that I discussed at the start of this program, with the energy and humanitarian crises that seem to be coming to Ukraine, well, I expect that at some point these tensions within the West will rise to the surface, and we're going to see a crisis within the NATO and Western system, the like of which we haven't seen since the end of the Second World War. Well, we'll see whether events do follow that track, whether in fact events in Ukraine continue in that way, or whether something can be papered over within the next few weeks or months. I'm sure there'll be some kind of agreement on an oil price cap, for example, but we'll see how effective that is. But I think, once more, I've spoken enough, and I think that this is perhaps a good moment to stop. I'll be obviously back with more developments as they shape out. In the meantime, let me remind you that you can catch up with all of our programs on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can follow all our videos there. You can participate in my Wednesday live streams on Locals. They are exclusive to Locals. And of course, you can support our work if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And of course, you can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other merchandise that you will find there. And that's me for today. Please remember, if you like this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And thank you again for joining me today, and have a very good day. And I hope that you'll be catching up with my next video, which should be coming out very soon.